Hi, folks, and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. Welcome on this snowy day here in North Carolina. We're going to be talking about regulation in this two-parter, and we're going to begin with thermoregulation. So animals are the only organisms that actually regulate their temperature, and there are two different main strategies for this regulation. We've got ectotherms, which are also known as thermoconformers, which are a lot of different types of animals, and then we've got endotherms, which are regulators, and those are your birds and mammals. So birds and mammals are the only endotherms that are out there. Ectotherms are all the rest of the different types of animals. And when we talk about thermoregulation, we're talking about temperature regulation. So we're talking about animals regulating their body temperature. So ectotherms, their internal temperatures conform to the ambient or environmental temperature. So if it's cold outside, they're going to be cold. If it's hot outside, they are going to be hot. And they have to change their environments in order to change their temperature. So something like a lizard, when it is, when it wants to heat up, it's got to go sit in the sun. And when it wants to go cool down, it needs to go sit in the shade. That's how they're going to be able to regulate their temperature. You notice that this is something that only animals are able to do because you got to be able to move around to do this, right? And plants and fungi, they don't really move around, so it'd be much more difficult for them to regulate their temperature. Then you've got your endotherms. Endotherms are able to maintain an internal temperature despite the external temperature, and there are lots of mechanisms for this temperature regulation. Mammals, right? We are able to regulate our temperature. It can be cold outside, and we can still be pretty warm. Now, obviously, if it gets too cold, we personally are not able to survive those temperatures very well. Consequently, when it's also hot outside, we're able to cool ourselves down. We have some mechanisms that are able to do that. This is just kind of showing you the difference between a endotherm and an ectotherm. The endotherm is going to kind of regulate its temperature. It's going to stay in a pretty solid range, whereas your ectotherm, its temperature is going to change dramatically with the ambient temperature. So why are organisms hot? Why are we as humans hot, whereas ectotherms are not? Well, all organisms use metabolic activity to produce heat. It's just that endothermic organisms have a much higher metabolic rate, so they're doing a lot more metabolism, doing a lot more cellular processes, and therefore we produce a lot more heat. We eat more food, we do more cellular respiration, more cellular work than ectotherms, and therefore we are producing a lot more heat, and that heat is what we we use to help regulate our temperature. How does heat exchange occur with the environment? Well, this is something that ectotherms and endotherms both do. We've got radiation, which is where you've got electromagnetic waves that are coming in, and they can be coming in or they can be coming off. If you've ever seen videos where you've got those thermal cameras, right? Those are electromagnetic waves that are being put off by our bodies. We also have conduction. Conduction is direct contact. Where it's like there's a rock that's been warming up and you go put your hand on the rock, you can feel that heat. That's conduction. We also have convection, which is air currents. So here's where your body will be heating up some air around it, and the air is moving around. If you've ever noticed being in the wind is cold because of convection. And then finally we've got evaporation, which is water loss. And this is something you may not think about as much, but water has energy, right? So when you lose water, when it's evaporating, you're losing that energy. Therefore, you are losing some of your temperature, right? Because remember, temperature is just simply a measure of the total kinetic energy of something, right? The average kinetic energy of something. So when you're evaporating, when you're losing water, you're actually losing temperature, you're losing energy. Kind of interesting. Now, some animals, particularly endotherms, use countercurrents. We've seen countercurrents before, and basically how these work is that your extremities are more likely to lose temperature than other places in your body. And this is particularly useful if you live in a place that it would be considered a heat sink. A heat sink is just something that is going to absorb a lot of heat. So think about the water, right? The water is going to be absorbing a lot of heat from an organism. So what they do is that their arteries and their veins, right, they run right next to one another, okay? So the artery has a high temperature because it's coming from the internal part of the body, and then that artery is going to be heating up the vein that's right next to it and losing some energy. And it's going to continue to heat up the vein all the way down to the very end of either the foot or the flipper in this case. And what that's going to do is it is going to preserve the heat and keep the heat closer towards the inside of the body and not out in the extremities. If the heat was all in the extremities, then you'd be losing a lot of water kind of in that, or sorry, not losing a lot of water, losing a lot of heat into the water at the tips, which would not be so great. We also have some other mechanisms, some more, I'm totally mind blanking right now. Endocrine system, some endocrine system mechanisms that help us to regulate. So if you are cold, what that's going to do is is going to signal your thermostat. You have an internal thermostat found in your hypothalamus, and it is going to activate some mechanisms that are going to help you warm. And so what that's going to do is that you're going to get your skeletal muscles that are going to contract, which is going to cause shivering. You're using ATP, you're going to generate heat. Your blood vessels in your skin are going to constrict, so you're not going to get as much blood in your skin vessels, so you're not going to be able to lose as much heat through that. As your temperature increases, you're going to shut off those mechanisms. If you're hot, you're going to begin sweating in order to help evaporate. And what that again is doing is that it's putting water on your skin. The water absorbs energy, and then the water evaporates, turns into a gas, and leaves. That is going to take energy away from your body, therefore cooling you. Your blood vessels are near the skin are going to dilate, which is going to help bring more heat, right? Because more blood, which is warm, from your internal part is going to go out into your externals, which is then going to cause that to lose more heat into the water that is evaporating, and you will cool off. So there are some different strategies that animals use in order to help regulate the temperature. Sunbathing is one of them. So we see the insect, the sea lion, or the seal. Sorry, it's not a sea lion, it's just a seal. And then the lizard, right? They like to sunbathe in order to heat themselves up. You also need some mechanisms to cool yourselves off. So these jackrabbits, they live in very hot environments. And you notice that they have these big ears with all the little blood vessels, right? You can see those inside there. What that does is it allows them to pump a lot of blood into their ears, which have the ability to radiate more heat than maybe other parts of their body, so they can cool themselves off as needed. Then as they get back to their good temperature, they can stop pumping quite as much blood into their ears. Organisms like hippos, right? They live in the water, so they use the water to help cool themselves off, even though they live in hot environments in Africa. So we've talked about this a little bit before, but metabolism is the total, sum of all the chemical reactions that are going on inside the organism, and it can be measured in a couple different ways. We could measure the heat exchange. So we could take an organism, put it in like some water or something like that, and measure the amount of heat exchange that it has with its environment. And that would be a good way to measure how much chemical processes are going on inside. We could also maybe measure the oxygen output or the oxygen intake, the CO2 output that the organism has. That's going to give us a good indicator of how much cellular respiration is going on, and therefore what the metabolic rate is. And obviously you have different methods based on what type of organism that it is you're studying. Now, when we measure metabolic rate for ectotherms, one of the things we find is that higher ambient temperatures lead to a higher metabolic rate. So what they do is that they say, okay, for ectotherms, we're just going to measure a standard metabolic rate, which is the metabolic rate at rest, so no exercise, at a particular temperature for that ectotherm. So when we measure metabolic rates for ectotherms, we talk about the standard metabolic rate. Now, for endotherms, their metabolic rate does not correlate with temperature. It pretty much stays the same all the time. Now, it will vary slightly with temperature. For example, when it's cold outside, your basal metabolic rate will increase slightly because you're going to be, using more energy. But in general, it's not related to temperature. And so what we do is we just say, okay, what's the minimum metabolic rate? Now, some of the trends that we kind of find when we do this is that larger organisms have a larger overall BMR, which makes sense. So an elephant is much larger than a shrew, so it uses a lot more energy, so it's going to have a much higher BMR in order to maintain itself. However, when we look at the BMR per kilogram of body size, what we actually find is that smaller organisms have a much higher metabolic rate. And this makes sense too, because smaller organisms have a much larger surface area to volume ratio. Therefore, they need to produce more energy in order to maintain their temperature, in order to be able to regulate their temperature, as opposed to a much larger organism, which has a much smaller surface area to volume ratio. Therefore, they're not going to be radiating as much heat based on the total BMR that they have. So small organisms have a larger BMR to their body mass than larger organisms. Now, we can also kind of look at energy budgets, and what we can see is that larger organisms, right, they need more energy. But if you were to compare two organisms that are the same size, however, one's an endotherm and one's an ectotherm, you'll see that the ectotherm uses a lot less energy, has a lot less energy requirements than something that is the same size that is an endotherm. And that's again because endotherms have a much higher metabolic rate. They are going to require a lot more energy because they are constantly doing all these processes in order to keep themselves warm. Oops, a little far. Okay, torpor. We'll talk briefly about torpor. This is sometimes called sleep. It's a state of decreased activity and metabolism. So you go into a torpor every night when you go to sleep. That's the reason why a lot of times you wake up cold in the morning. You've decreased your metabolic activity. Therefore, you're not producing as much heat. You are going to end up being cold. There are two different kind of specialized kinds of torpor. You've got hibernation and estivation. Hibernation is long-term winter torpor. It's usually found in cold places. And you've got estivation, which is long-term summer torpor, where it is so hot that it is actually more beneficial for organisms to kind of burrow down into the ground and find a cool place to hang out for a little while. So anyways, I hope this was interesting. Thanks for watching. Hopefully we'll thaw out soon and we'll get back into school. But, I'll see you next time.